Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It must have been somewhere in the early 80s that on a similar occasion I had the honor to be the moderator on an evening featuring the even more prolific American writer by the name of Joyce Carol Oates. During the dinner that preceded the event, she, having heard that I was also a short story writer, asked me if I was interested in submitting a few of my stories in translation to the literary magazine that she and her husband were editing. I did so, of course, and received them back a couple of weeks later with a note by Miss Oates' husband explaining that I obviously was a very talented writer, but alas, the stories were just not right for their magazine. Wasn't that Hudson Review? The Hudson Review? Or Princeton Review, yeah. He added a PS to his note, though, as a sort of recommendation and suggestion as to what type of stories were right for them. It said, "Have you ever read anything by T. Coraghessen Boyle? We think he is great." I had come across Mr. Boyle's name every now and then, but had only read a couple of his stories, including the one about the blues singer Robert Johnson that I had translated and published in a literary supplement that I edited at that time. But then I saw him quoted in Esquire magazine the following month. It was one of those cheap shot questionnaires that gives the magazine the right to use a dozen famous writers' names on their cover without having to pay them. And this month's question was, if you had not been a writer, what would you prefer to be or have been? Or words to that effect. T. Coraghessen Boyle's answer was the most straightforward, and I quote from memory. "If I would not have been a writer, I would have joined a second-rate rock and roll band and drugged myself into oblivion." Is that more or less correct or not? Yeah. I relished that answer and thought to myself, here is a writer that I'm going to like very much. It was many years later that I learned that Mr. Boyle's reply had its firm roots in his personal life so far. The alternative career he spelled out in Esquire magazine was not a mere fantasy, not just a flirtation with the seedy side of life, but had in fact been his life for many years up to the moment he seriously started writing. His first book was a collection of stories entitled Descent of Man, and that was soon followed by a series of astounding novels which seemed to be the product of a limitless, exuberant imagination. The first one was called Water Music, about the Scottish traveller Mungo Park, who discovered, for the wide world, the origins of the Niger River and drowned in the process, at least according to the book. It was followed by a novel entitled Budding Prospects, and then in 1987 came the novel that not only brought him the PEN/Faulkner Award for American fiction, but that also finally endeared a large Dutch audience to him. World's End, translated in our language as Duivel's End. It is the story of two Dutch families which settled in what is now known as the state of New York in the late 17th century. The Van Worts, representatives of the ruling Dutch aristocrats, and the Van Brunts, the ancestors of the main personage of the book, Walter Van Brunt. With enormous virtuosity, Mr. Boyle weaves his story in the area of the Hudson Valley, where people pray to St. Nicolaas in their little town of Schobbejakken, where mensen in de pekel zitten en eat their hutspot, and where huisvrouwen bake bruinbrood. The storyline takes us from the days just after their settlement and the subordination of the Native Americans through the 40s of this century to the late 60s, where Walter Van Brunt loses both feet and, thus literally cut off from his roots, decides to go about searching for them. For the roots, that is, not the feet. An impressive novel that established him as one of the foremost writers of his generation. In the appraisal of the New York Times Book Review, the peak achievement thus far in a career that seems now to have no clear limits. He has been very prolific and successful since, writing more novels like East is East and the hilarious The Road to Wellville, which takes us to Battle Creek, Michigan, in the beginning of this century, where we encounter the Temple of Health and the certainly not enlightened regime of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of course, the Kellogg's cornflake and many a nutty theory about human health. It is maybe Mr. Boyle's most hilarious and flamboyant book so far, and one that settled his reputation as a master of invention, grand guignol, and biting satire. Elements that are also present in the dozens of stories that he wrote in between, and were collected in the volumes Descent of Man, the one that I already mentioned, Greasy Lake, If the River Was Whiskey, and most recently, Without a Hero. Stories that deal with the fatal romance of Dwight Eisenhower for Nina Khrushcheva, with politicians who very literally promise you the moon, with Idi Amin as he presides over the Second International Dada Fair or Convention, whatever was it, was something like that, and with Gogol's Akakievich and his overcoat reappearing under the Soviet regime, to mention only a few examples. His most recent work, and the one that will not be the subject of tonight's talk because he will be reading a brand new story that you have not read or heard anywhere before, is called The Tortilla Curtain, the Tortilla Grens in the Dutch translation that was published by Contact. It is as much a work of and about his present habitat as World's End was of and about the area where he was born, the southern part of the great state of California, where mankind redefines and reinvents itself, but also finds its limits. Limits of compassion, for instance, in the person of Delaney Mosbacher, liberal thinker and columnist for the environmental magazine Wide Open Spaces, who roams about in the splendid Californian nature that he and his wife and neighbors have just carved a substantial part out of with their privileged houses in Arroyo Blanco estates. Mr. Boyle alternates his story between the Mosbachers, their neighbors, and domestic animals, who are all named after a member of the Sitwell family, and an illegal Mexican couple, Candido and America Rincon, who have entered the US of A as hundreds of thousands of others have done before them, looking for work and a slice of the American dream. For Delaney, the as yet untamed land under the naked sky is a source of adventure and romanticism, but for the Rincons it is just a bare necessity, forced as they are to live in the canyon just off Arroyo Blanco estates. As the story develops, Delaney Mosbacher's liberal worldview gradually caves in and makes way for hatred. He is very much a NIMBY, and as the Tortilla Curtain, that was once intended to seal off Southern California from Mexico, moves up to his own backyard, his paper sympathy for the underprivileged evaporates. It is a moving and also topical novel that shows the reader a once again unexpected side of the writer who is our guest tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure and an honor to introduce you Mr. T.C. Boyle.
Well, thank you for the nice introduction. Well, this is a special occasion for me. Not only am I in one of my favorite cities in the world, but this is the very last night and the last performance of a book tour that has lasted for 2.5 months. And I have only slept in my own bed for about 7 days during that period. And the frightening thing is I'm starting to like hotel food. During this time, though, I did have an opportunity when I was in Philadelphia a few weeks ago to go to the movies. They gave me half a day off. I went to the movies. And I saw Spike Lee's new movie, Clockers. But I can't give you a review because I only saw 2/3 of it. It was in this very funky old theater downtown, and the electricity went off 2/3 of the way through. But it was a great and rewarding day for me because I did get to see 5 separate trailers that day of coming attractions. And I developed a theory of American cinema, and here it is. Now, in Hollywood, basically, we are making two types of movies. Movies with explosions and movies without explosions. And generally, I prefer the latter. So, I took this wonderful apprehension and applied it to literature. And I think now, in America, we are producing two types of books, in fiction anyway. Books that contain vampires, lawyers, and detectives, and books that do not contain vampires, lawyers, and detectives. And so, the Tortilla Curtain will not have any of those elements. If you're looking for vampires, detectives, and lawyers, forget it. So, that said, Jan gave a wonderful introduction to the new book, and I'm a little bored with it, frankly, after reading it every night for 2.5 months. So I thought I would give you something altogether new. This is a new short story that I wrote immediately on completing the novel last year. And it's not been published anywhere, although it will appear in Playboy, I think, in March or April of next year. And here's the scenario. I read in the newspaper last fall a little article in the LA Times. There is a group of women in LA, 100 or so, who have formed a club for the purpose of meeting men. This club will take them to exotic locales 3 or 4 times a year. They'll arrange to go on a trip together, and at the other end, men will gather and they will meet. On this particular weekend that I've written about, they went to Alaska because in LA they were fed up with the kind of men they were meeting in the singles bars. They weren't very serious types. They were degenerates. They felt they would go to Alaska where they could meet some men with some true grit. And I felt that's all. That's the story. And I felt that the true story of that weekend needed to be told. And so here it is. This is called Termination Dust, and it's narrated by one of the men in Alaska who was there to receive these women. Termination Dust. There were 107 of them, of all ages, shapes, and sizes, from 25 and 30-year-olds in dresses that looked like they were made of saran wrap, to a couple of big-beamed older types in pantsuits who could have been somebody's mother, and I mean somebody grown with a goatee beard and a job at McDonald's. I was there to meet them when they came off the plane from Los Angeles. I and Peter Merchant, whose travel agency had arranged the whole weekend in partnership with the Beverly Hills concern. And there were a couple of other guys there, too. Eager beavers like JJ Hotel, and the bad element, by which I mean Bud Withers specifically, who didn't want to cough up the $150 for the buffet, the Malibu beach party, and the auction afterwards. They were hoping for maybe a sniff of something gratis, but I was there to act as a sort of buffer and make sure that didn't happen. Peter was all smiles as we came up to the first of the ladies, Susan Abrams by her name tag, and started handing out corsages, one to a lady, and we chimed out in chorus, "Welcome to Anchorage, land of the grizzly and the true-hearted man." Well, it was pretty corny. It was Peter's idea, not mine. And I felt a little foolish with the first few. Hard-looking women. Divorcees for sure, maybe even legal secretaries or lawyers into the bargain. But when I saw this little one with eyes the color of glacial melt about 6 deep in the line, I really began to perk up. Her name tag was done in calligraphy, not hand-lettered instead of computer-generated like the rest of them. And that really tugged at me, the care that went into it. And I gave her hand a squeeze and said, "Hi, Geordie, welcome to Alaska," when I gave her the corsage. She seemed a little dazed, and I chalked it up to the flight and the drinks and the general party atmosphere that must certainly have prevailed on that plane. 107 single women on their way for the Columbus Day weekend in a state that boasted 3 eligible bachelors for every one. But that wasn't it at all. She'd hardly had a glass of Chablis, as it turned out. What I took to be confusion, lethargy, whatever, was just wonderment. As I was later to learn, she'd been drawn to the country all her life, had read and dreamed about it since she was a girl growing up in Altadena, California, within sight of the Rose Bowl. She was bookish, an English teacher, in fact, and she had a new work leather high-grade edition of Wuthering Heights wedged under the arm that held her suitcase and traveling bag. I guessed her to be maybe late 20s, early 30s. "Thank you," she said, in this whispery little voice that made me feel about 13 years old all over again. And then she squinted those snow-melt eyes to take in my face and the spread of me. I should say I'm a big man, one of the biggest in the bush around Boynton. 6'5" and 242, and not much of that gone yet to fat. And then she read my name off my name tag and added, in a deep diving puff of a little floating wisp of a voice, "Ned." Then she was gone, and it was the next woman in line, with a face like a topographic map in the grip of a lumberjack, and then the next, and the next. And all the while I'm wondering how much Geordie's going to go for at the auction, and if 125, which is about all I'm prepared to spend, is going to be enough. The girls, women, ladies, whatever, rested up at their hotel for a while and did their ablutions and ironed their outfits and put on their makeup, while Peter and Susan Abrams fluttered around making sure all the little details of the evening had been worked out. I sat at the bar drinking Mexican beer to get in the mood. I'd barely finished my first when I looked up, and who did I see but JJ and Bud, with maybe half a dozen local types in tow, all of them looking as lean and hungry as a winter cat. Bud ignored me and started chatting up the Anchorage boys with his eternal line of bullshit about living off the land in his cabin in the bush outside Boynton, which was absolutely the purest, undiluted nonsense, as anybody who'd known him for more than half a minute could testify. But JJ settled in beside me with a combination yodel and sigh and offered to buy me a drink, which I accepted. "Got one picked out?" he said. And he had this mocking grin on his face, as if the whole business of the Los Angeles contingent was a bad joke, though I knew it was all an act, and he was as eager and sweetly optimistic as I was myself. The image of 107 women in their underwear suddenly flashed through my mind, and I pictured Geordie in a black brassiere and matching panties, and I blushed and ducked my head and tried on an awkward little smile. "Yeah," I admitted. "Well, I'll be damned if Mr. Confidence down there," a gesture for Bud, who was neck-deep in guano with the weekend outdoorsmen in their LL Bean outfits, "if he doesn't have one too. Says he's got her room number already and told her he'd bid whatever it takes for a date with her, even if he had to dip into the family fortune." My laugh was a bitter, strangled thing. Bud was just out of jail, where he'd done 6 months on a criminal mischief charge for shooting out the windows in 3 cabins in the sunny side of my store on the main street, the only street in downtown Boynton, population 170. He didn't have a pot to piss in, except what he got from the VA or welfare or whatever it was. It was hard to say, judging the way he seemed to confuse fact and fiction. That and the rat-trapped cabin he'd built on government land along the Yukon River, and that was condemned. I didn't even know what he'd done with his kid after Linda left him, and I didn't want to guess. "How do you even get here?" I said. JJ was a little man with a bald pate and a full snow-white beard, a widower and a musician who cooked as mean a moose tri-tip with garlic and white gravy as any man who'd come into the country in the past 10 years. He shrugged, set his beer mug down on the bar. "Same as you and me." I was incredulous. "You mean he drove? Where'd he get the car?" "All I know is he told me last week he had this buddy who was going to lend him a brand new Toyota Land Cruiser for the weekend, and that furthermore, he was planning on going home to Boynton with the second Mrs. Withers, even if he did have to break down and shell out the $150 for the party and all. It's an investment," he says, as if any woman would be crazy enough to go any place with him, let alone a cabin out in the hind end of nowhere. I guess I was probably stupefied with amazement at this point, and I couldn't really manage a response. I was just looking over the top of my beer at the back of Bud's head and his elbow resting on the bar, and then the necks of his boots, as if I could catch a glimpse of the plastic feet he's got stuffed in there. I'd seen them once, those feet, when he first got back from the hospital, and he came round the store for a pint of something, already half drunk and wearing a pair of shorts under his coat, though it was -30 out. "Hey, Ned," he said to me in this really nasty, accusatory voice, "you see what you and the rest of them done to me?" And he flipped open the coat to show his ankles and the straps and the plastic feet that were exactly like the pink molded feet of a mannequin in a department store window. I was worried. I didn't want to let on to JJ, but I knew Bud. I knew how smooth he was, especially if you weren't forewarned, and I knew women found him attractive. I kept thinking, What if it's Geordie he's after? But then I told myself the chances were pretty remote, what with 107 eager women to choose from, and even if it was, there were still 106 others, and one of them had to be for me. Statistics. There were 32 women out of a population of 170 in Boynton, all of them married and all of them invisible, even when they were sitting around the bar I run in the back room of my store. Average winter temperature was minus 45, and there was a period of nearly 2 months when we never saw the sun. Add to that the fact that 9 out of 10 adults in Alaska have a drinking problem, and you can imagine what life was like on the bad days. I was no exception to the rule. The winter was long, the nights were lonely, and booze was a way to take the edge off the loneliness and the boredom that just slowed you down till you felt like you were barely alive. I was no drunk, don't get me wrong. Nothing like Bud Withers, not even close. And I tried to keep a check on myself, going without even a whiff of the stuff every other day at least, and trying my best to keep a hopeful outlook. Which is why I left the bar after 2 beers to go back to Peter's place and douse myself with aftershave, solidify the hair around my bald spot with a blast of hairspray, and slip into the sport coat I'd last worn at Chiz Peltz's funeral. He froze to death the same night Bud lost his feet, and I was the one who had to pry him away from the back door of the barroom in the morning. He was like a bronze statue, huddled over the bottle, with his parka pulled up over his head, and that was how we had to bury him, bottle and all. Then I made my way back through the roaring streets to the hotel and the ballroom that could have contained all of Boynton and everybody in it, feeling like an overawed freshman, pressed up against the wall at the weekly social. But I wasn't a freshman anymore, and this was no social. I was 34 years old, and I was tired of living like a monk. I needed someone to talk to, a companion, a helpmate, a wife. And this was my best chance of finding one. As soon as I saw Geordie standing there by the hors d'oeuvre table, the other 106 women vanished from sight, and I knew I'd been fooling myself back there at the bar. She was the one, the only one. And the longing for her was a continuous ache that never let up from that moment on. She was with another woman, and they had their heads together, talking, but I couldn't have honestly told you whether this other woman was tall or short, blonde, brunette, or redhead. I saw Geordie, and nothing more. "Hi," I said, the sport coat gouging at my underarms and clinging to my back like a living thing. "Remember me?" She sure did. And she reached up to take hold of my hand and peck a little kiss into the outer fringe of my beard. The other woman, the invisible one, faded away into the background before she could be introduced. I found myself at a loss for what to say next. My hands felt big and cumbersome, as if they'd just been stapled on as I came through the door, and the sport coat flapped its wings and dug its talons into my neck. I wanted a drink, badly. "Would you like a drink?" Geordie whispered, fracturing the words into tiny little nuggets of meaning. She was holding a glass of white wine in one hand, and she was wearing a pair of big, glittering, dangly earrings that hung all the way down to the sculpted bones of her bare shoulders. I let her lead me up to the long folding table with the 4 bartenders hustling around on one side and all the women pressed up against the other, while the raw-boned bush crazies did their best to talk them to death. And then I had a double scotch in my hand and felt better. "It's beautiful country," I said, toasting her, it, the ballroom, and everything beyond with a clink of our glasses. "Especially out my way, in Boynton. Peaceful," I said. "You know?" "Oh, I know," she said, and for the first time I noticed a hint of something barely contained bubbling just below the surface of that smoky voice. Or at least I can imagine. I mean, from what I've read, that's in the Yukon watershed, isn't it, Boynton? This was my cue, and I was grateful for it. I went into a rambling 5-minute oration on the geographic and geological high points of the bush around Boynton, with sidelights on the local flora, fauna, and human curiosities, tactfully avoiding any reference to the sobering statistics that made me question what I was doing there myself. It was a speech, all right, one that would have done any town booster proud. When I was through with it, I saw that my glass was empty and that Geordie was squirming in her boots to get a word in edgewise. "Sorry," I said, dipping my head in apology. "I didn't mean to talk your ear off. It's just that..." And here I got ahead of myself, my tongue loosened by the seeping burn of the scotch. "It's just that we don't get to talk much to anybody new unless we make the trek into Fairbanks, and that's pretty rare. And especially not to someone as good-looking, as attractive as you." Geordie managed to flush prettily at the compliment, and then she was off on a speech of her own, decrying the lack of the human dimension in city life, the constant fuss and hurry and hassle, the bad air, the polluted beaches, and, this really got my attention, the lack of men with old-fashioned values, backbone, and grit. When she delivered this last line, I don't know if that's the way she phrased it exactly, but that was the gist of it. She leveled those glaciated eyes on me, and I felt like I could walk on water. We were standing in line at the buffet table when Bud Withers shuffled in. It was surprising how well he managed to do on those plastic feet. If you didn't know what was wrong with him, you'd never guess. You could see something wasn't quite right. Every step he took looked like a recovery, as if he'd just been shoved from behind. But as I say, it wasn't all that abnormal. Anyway, I maneuvered myself in between Geordie and his line of sight, hunkering over her like an eagle masking its kill, and went on with our conversation. She was curious about life in Boynton, really obsessing over the smallest details, and I'd been telling her how much freedom you have out in the bush, how you can live your life the way you want, in tune with nature instead of shut up in some stucco box next to a shopping mall. "But what about you?" she said. "Aren't you stuck in your store?" "Oh, I get antsy. I just closed the place down for a couple of days," I said. She looked shocked, or maybe skeptical is a better word. "What about your customers?" I shrugged to show her how casual everything was. "It's not like I run the store for the public welfare," I said, "and they do have the nougat to drink at, Clarence Ford's place." Actually, Clarence meant to call it the nugget, but he's a terrible speller, and I always go out of my way to give it a literal pronunciation just to irritate him. So, anytime I want, dead of winter, whatever, I'll just hang out the gone trapping sign, dig out my snowshoes, and go off and run my trap line. Geordie seemed to consider this, the hair round her temples frizzing up with the steam from the serving trays. "And what are you after?" she said. "Mink?" "Marten, lynx, fox, and wolf," I said. The food was good, it ought to have been for what we were paying, and I heaped up my plate, but not so much as to make her think I was a hog or anything. There was a silence. I became aware of the music then, a Beach Boys song rendered live by a band from Juneau at the far end of the room. "With a fox," I said, and I didn't know whether she wanted to hear this or not. "You come up to him, and he's caught by the foot, and maybe he's tried to gnaw that foot off, and he's snarling like a chainsaw. Well, what you do is, you just rap him across the snout with a stick like this, and it knocks him right out, like magic. Then you put a little pressure on his throat till he stops breathing, and you get a nice clean fur, you know what I mean?" I was worried she might be one of those animal liberation nuts that want to protect every last rat, tick, and flea, but she didn't look bothered at all. In fact, her eyes seemed to get distant for a minute. Then she bent over to dish up a healthy portion of the king crab and straightened up with a smile. "Just like the pioneers," she said. That was when Bud sniffed us out. He butted right in line, put a hand round Geordie's waist, and drew her to him for a kiss, full plate and all, which she had to hold out awkwardly away from her body, or there would have been king crab and avocado salad down the front of that silky black dress she was wearing. "Sorry I'm late, babe," Bud said, and he picked up a plate and began mounding it high with cold cuts and smoked salmon. Geordie turned to me then, and I couldn't read her face, not at all, but of course I knew in that instant that Bud had got to her, and though the chances were 107 to 1 against it, she was the one who'd given him her room number. I was dazed by the realization, and after I got over being dazed, I felt the anger coming up in me like foam in a loose can of beer. "Ned," she murmured, "do you know Bud?" Bud gave me an ugly look, halfway between a fuck you and a leer of triumph. I tried to keep my cool for Geordie's sake. "Yeah," was all I said. She led us to a table in back, right up near the band, one of those long banquet-type tables, and Bud and I sat down on either side of her, jockeying for position. "Bud," she said, as soon as we were settled, and Ned, turning to me and then back to him again, "I'm sure you can both help me with this, and I really want to know the truth of it because it's part and parcel of my whole romance with Alaska, and now I've read somewhere that it isn't true." She had to raise her voice to be heard over the strains of my Little Deuce coupe. This was the Malibu beach party, after all, replete with the pile of sand in the corner and a 20-foot-high poster of Gidget in a bikini. And we both leaned in to hear her better. "What I want to know is," she said, Do you really have 72 different words for snow in the Eskimo language, I mean? Bud didn't even give me a glance, just started in with his patented line of bullshit, how he'd spent 2 years with the Inuit up around Point Barrow, chewing walrus hides with the old ladies and dodging polar bears, and how he felt that 72 was probably a low estimate. Then he fell into some dialect he must have invented on the spot, all the while giving Geordie this big, moony smile that made me want to puke. Till I took her elbow, and she turned to me, and the faux Eskimo caught like a bone in his throat. "We call it termination dust," I said. She lifted her eyebrows. Bud was on the other side of her, looking bored and greedy, shoveling up his food like a hyperphagic bear. It was the first moment he'd shut his mouth since he'd butted in. "It's because of the road," I explained. "We're at the far end of it, a 2-lane gravel road that runs north from the Alaska Highway and dead ends in Boynton, the last place on the continent you can drive to." She was still waiting. The band fumbled through the end of the song, and the room suddenly came alive with the buzz of 100 conversations. Bud glanced up from his food to shoot me a look of unadulterated hate. "Go on," she said. I shrugged, toyed with my fork. "That's it," I said. "The first snow, the first good one, and it's all over till spring. The end. It's all she wrote. If you're in Boynton, you're going to stay there." "And if you're not," she said, something satirical in her eyes as she tucked away a piece of crab with a tiny 2-pronged fork. Bud answered for me. "Then you're not going to make it." The auction was for charity, all proceeds to be divided equally among the Fur Trappers Retirement Home, the AIDS Hospice, and the Greater Anchorage Food Bank. I had no objection to that. I was happy to do my part. But as I said, I was afraid somebody would outbid me for a date with Geordie. Not that the date was anything more than just that, a date. But it was the chance to spend the better part of the next day with the woman of your choice. And when you only had 2.5 days, that was a big chunk of it. I talked to JJ and some of the others, and they were all planning to bid on this woman or that, and to take them out on a fishing boat or up in a super cub to see the glaciers east of town, or even out into the bush to look over their cabins and their prospects. Nobody talked about sex. That would demean the spirit of the thing. But it was there, under the surface, like a burning promise. The first woman went for $75. She was about 40 or so, and she looked like a nurse or dental technician, somebody who really knew her way around a bedpan or saliva sucker. The rest of us stood around and watched while 3 men exercised their index fingers, and the auctioneer, who else but Peter, went back and forth between them with all sorts of comic asides until they'd reached their limit. "Going once, going twice," he chimed, milking the moment for all it was worth. "Sold to the man in the red hat." I watched the guy, nobody I knew, an Anchorage type, as he mounted the 3 steps to the stage they'd set up by the sandpit, and I felt something stir inside me when this dental technician of 40 smiled like all the world was melting and gave him a kiss right out of the last scene of a movie, and the 2 of them walked off hand in hand. My heart was hammering like a broken piston. I couldn't see Bud in the crowd, but I knew what his intentions were. And as I said, 125 was my limit. There was no way I was going past that, no matter what. Geordie came up 9th. 2 or 3 of the women that preceded her were really something to look at, secretaries probably, or cocktail waitresses, but Geordie easily outclassed them. It wasn't only that she was educated. It was the way she held herself, the way she stepped up to the platform with a private little smile and let those unquenchable eyes roam over the crowd till they settled on me. I stood a head taller than anybody else there, so I guess it wasn't so hard to pick me out. I gave her a little wave and then immediately regretted it because I'd tipped my hand. The first bid was $100 from some clown in a lumberjack shirt who looked as if he'd just been dragged out from under a bush somewhere. I swear there was lint in his hair, or worse. Peter had said, "Who'll start us off here? Do I hear an opening bid?" And this guy stuck up his hand and said, 100, just like that. I was stunned. But I was prepared for, but this was something else altogether. What was this guy thinking? A lumberjack shirt and he was bidding on Geordie? It was all I could do to keep myself from striding through the crowd and jerking the guy out of his boots like some weed along the roadside. But then another hand popped up just in front of me, and this guy must have been 60 if he was a day, the back of his neck all rutted and seamed and piss-yellow hairs growing out of his ears. And he spoke up just as casually as if he was ordering a drink at the bar. 120. I was in a panic, beset on all sides, and I felt the tongue thickening in my throat as I threw up my arm. "One," I gasped, "125!" Then it was Bud's turn. I heard him before I saw him slouching there in the second row, right up near the stage. He didn't even bother raising his hand. "150, he said. And right away the old bird in front of me croaked out, "175. I was in a sweat, wringing my hands till I thought the left would crush the right and vice versa, the sport coat digging into me like a hair shirt, like a straitjacket, too small under the arms and across the shoulders. 125 was my limit absolutely and unconditionally, and even then I'd be straining to pay for the date itself. But I felt my arm jerking up as if it was attached to a wire. 176, I shouted. And everybody in the room turned round to stare at me. I heard a laugh from up front, a dirty, sniggering little stab of a laugh that shot hot lava through my veins. Bud's laugh. Bud's mocking, hateful, naysaying laugh. And then Bud's voice crashed through the wall of wonder surrounding my bid and pronounced my doom. $250, he said. And I stood there, stupefied, as Peter called out, "Going once, going twice," and slammed down the gavel. I don't remember what happened next, but I turned away before Bud could shuffle up to the stage and take Geordie in his arms and receive the public kiss that was meant for me. Turned away and staggered toward the bar like a gut-shot deer. I try to control my temper, I really do. I know it's a failing of mine, but I guess I must have gotten a little rough with these two LL Bean types that were blocking my access to the scotch. Nothing outrageous, nothing more than letting them know in no uncertain terms that they were in my path, and that if they liked the way their arms still fit in their sockets, they'd dance on out of there like the sugar plum fairy on her court. But still, I regretted it. Nothing else that night rings too clear, not after Geordie went to Bud for the sake of mere money. But I kept thinking, over and over, as if a splinter was implanted in my brain, how in Christ's name did that unemployed son of a bitch come up with $250? I rang Geordie's room first thing in the morning. Yes, there was that at least. She'd given me her room number too. But now I wondered if she wasn't just playing mind games. There was no answer, and that told me something I didn't want to know. I inquired at the desk, and the clerk said she'd checked out the night before, and I must have had a look on my face because he volunteered that he didn't know where she'd gone. It was then that the invisible woman from the cocktail party materialized out of nowhere, visible suddenly in a puke green running suit with greasy hair and a face all pitted and naked without a hint of makeup. "You looking for Geordie?" she said, and maybe she recognized me. The drumming in my chest suddenly slowed. I felt ashamed of myself, felt awkward and out of place, my head windy and cavernous from all that sorrowful scotch. "Yes," I admitted. She took pity on me then and told me the truth. "Oh, she went to some little town with that guy from the auction last night, said she'd be back for the plane on Monday." 10 minutes later, I was in my Chevy half-ton truck, tooling down the highway for Fairbanks and the gravel road to Boynton. I felt an urgency bordering on the manic, and my foot was like a cement block on the accelerator, because once Bud got to Boynton, I knew what he was going to do. He'd ditch the car, which I wouldn't doubt he'd borrowed without the legitimate owner's consent, whoever that might be, and then he'd load up his canoe with supplies and Geordie and run down the river for his trespasser's cabin. And if that happened, Geordie wouldn't be making any plane. Not on Monday. Maybe not ever. I tried to think about Geordie and how I was going to rescue her from all that and how grateful she'd be once she realized what kind of person she was dealing with in Bud and what his designs were. But every time I summoned her face, Bud's rose up out of some dark hole in my consciousness to blot it out. I saw him sitting at the bar that night he lost his feet, sitting there drinking steadily, though I'd 86'd him 3 times over the course of the past year and 3 times relented. He was on a tear, drinking with Chiz Peltz and this Indian I'd never laid eyes on before who claimed to be a full-blooded flathead from Montana. It was January, a few days after New Year's, and it was maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon and dark beyond the windows. I was drinking too, tending bar but helping myself to the scotch, because it was one of those days when time has no meaning and your life drags like it has brakes on it. There were maybe 8 other people in the place: Ronnie Peralta and his wife Louise, Roy Treadwell, who services snow machines and sells cordwood, Richie Oliver, and some others. I don't know where JJ was that day. playing solitaire in his cabin, I guess, staring at the walls, who knows. Anyway, Bud was on his tear, and he started using language I don't tolerate in the bar, not any time, and especially not when ladies are present. And I told him to can it, and things got nasty. The upshot was, I had to pin the Indian to the back wall by his throat and rip Bud's parka half off him before I convinced the three of them to finish up their drinking over at the Nougat, which is where they went, looking ugly. Clarence Ford put up with them till around 7 or so, and then he kicked them out and barred the door, and they sat in Chiz Peltz's car with the engine running and the heater on full, passing a bottle back and forth till I don't know what hour. Of course, the car eventually ran out of gas, and the three of them passed out like zombies, and the overnight temperature went down to something like -60, and as I said, Chiz didn't make it. And how he wound up outside my place, I'll never know. We helicoptered Bud to the hospital in Fairbanks, but they couldn't save his feet. The Indian, I've never seen him since, just seemed to shake it off with the aid of a dozen cups of coffee laced with free bourbon at the Nougat. Bud never forgave me or Clarence or anybody else in town. He was a sorehead and griper of the first degree, the sort of person who blames all his miseries on everybody but himself. And now he had Geordie, this sweet, dreamy English teacher who probably thought Alaska was all northern exposure and charmingly eccentric people saying witty things to each other. I knew Bud. I knew how he would have portrayed that ratty, illegal, tumble-down cabin tour, and how he would have told her it was just a hop, skip, and jump down the river and not the 12 miles it actually was. And what was she going to do when she found out? Call a cab? These were my thoughts as I passed through Fairbanks, headed southeast on the Alaska Highway, and finally turned north for Boynton. It was late in the afternoon, and I still had 180 miles of gravel road to traverse before I even hit Boynton, let alone catch up with Bud. I could only hope he'd stopped off at the Nougat for his usual fix of vodka, but the chances of that were slim because he'd want to hustle Geordie down the river before she got a good idea of who he was and what his designs were. And that was another thing. I just didn't understand her. Just didn't. He'd put in the highest bid and she was a good sport, okay. But to drive all night with that slime? To put up with his bullshit for all those crippling hours, maybe even fall for it? Poor Geordie. Poor Geordie. I pulled into Boynton in record time, foot to the floor all the way, and skidded to a halt in the gravel lot out front of my store. There were only 3 other cars there, each as familiar as my own. And Ronnie Perrault, who I'd asked to help out for the weekend, was presiding over a very quiet bar. "Ronnie," I said, coming into the bar to the strains of Lyle Lovett singing Mac the Knife like he was half dead, "You seen Bud?" Ronnie was hunched lovingly over a cigarette and a Myers and Coke, holding hands with Louise. He was wearing a Seattle Mariners cap backwards on his head, and his eyes were distant, the eyes of a man in rum nirvana. Howard Walpole, 70 years old and with a bad back and runny eyes, was at the far end of the bar, and Roy Treadwell and Richie Oliver were playing cards at the table by the stove. Ronnie was slow, barely flowing, like the grenadine in the back pantry that hardly gets any heat. "I thought," he said, chewing over the words, "I thought you wasn't going to be back till Tuesday." "Hey, Nettie," Doug shouted. "How many you bring back?" "Bud," I repeated, addressing the room at large. "Anybody seen Bud?" Well, they had to think about that. They were all pretty hazy. While the cat's away, the mice will play. But it was Howard who came out of it first. "Sure," he said. "I seen him." And he leaned so far forward over his drink I thought he was going to fall into it. "Early this morning in a brand new Toyota Land Cruiser, which I don't know where he got. And he had a woman with him." And then, as if remembering some distant bit of trivia, "How was that flesh bazaar anyway? You married yet?" Louise snickered, but I was in no mood. "Where'd he go?" I said. Hopeful, always hopeful, but I already knew the answer. Howard did something with his leg, a twitch he developed to ease the pain in his back. "I didn't talk to him," he said, "but I think he was going downriver." The river wasn't too rough this time of year, but it was still moving at a pretty good clip, and I have to admit I'm not exactly an ace with the canoe. I'm too big for anything that small, and I always feel awkward and top-heavy. But there I was, moving along with the current, thinking one thing and one thing only: Geordie. It would be a bitch coming back up, but there'd be 2 of us paddling, and I kept focusing on how grateful she was going to be for getting her out of there. More grateful than if I'd bid $1,000 for her and took her out for steak 3 nights in a row. But then the strangest thing happened. the sky went gray, and it began to snow. It just doesn't snow that early in the year. Not ever, or hardly ever. But there it was. The wind came up the bed of the river and threw these dry little pellets of ice in my face, and I realized how stupid I'd been. I was already a couple of miles downriver from town, and though I had a light parka and mittens with me, a chunk of cheese, loaf of bread, that sort of thing, I really hadn't planned on any weather. It was a surprise, a big surprise. Of course, at that point I was sure it was only a squall, something to whiten the ground for a day and then melt off. But I still felt stupid out there on the river without any real protection, and I began to wonder how Geordie would see it. The way she was worried about all the names for snow and how sick at heart she must have been just about then with Bud's shithole of a cabin and no escape and the sun coming down like a life sentence. And I leaned into the paddle. It was after dark when I came round the bend and saw the lights of the cabin off through the scrim of snow. I was wearing my parka and mittens now, and I must have looked like a snowman propped up in the white envelope of the canoe, and I could feel the ice forming in my beard where the breath froze coming out of my nostrils. I smelled wood smoke and watched the soft, tumbling sky. Was I angry? Not really. Not yet. I'd hardly thought about what I was doing up to this point. It all just seemed so obvious. The son of a bitch had gotten her, whether it was under false pretenses or not. And Geordie, sweet Geordie, with Emily Bronte tucked under her arm, couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams what she was getting into. No one would have blamed me. For all intents and purposes, Bud had abducted her. He had. Still, when I actually got there, when I could smell the smoke and see the lamps burning, I felt shy suddenly. I couldn't just burst in and announce that I'd come to rescue her, could I? And I could hardly pretend I just happened to be in the neighborhood. Plus, that was Bud in there. And he was as purely nasty as a rattlesnake with a hand clamped around the back of its head. There was no way he was going to like this, no matter how you looked at it. So what I did was pull the canoe up on the bank about 100 yards from the cabin, the scrape of the gravel masked by the snow, and crept up on the place, as stealthy as a big man can be. I didn't want to alert Bud's dog and blow the whole thing. But that was just it, I realized, tiptoeing through the snow like an ice statue come to life. What thing would I blow? I didn't have a plan, not even a clue. In the end, I did the obvious, snuck up to the window and peered in. I couldn't see much at first, the window all smeared with grime, but I gingerly rubbed the pane with the wet heel of my mitten and things came into focus. The stove in the corner was going, a mouth of flame with the door flung open wide for the fireplace effect. Next to the stove was a table with a bottle of wine on it and 2 glasses, one of them half full. And I saw the dog then, a Malamute-looking thing, asleep underneath it. There was some homemade furniture, a sort of couch with an old single mattress thrown over it, a couple of crude chairs of bent aspen with the bark still on it. 4 or 5 white plastic buckets of water were lined up against the wall, which was festooned with the usual backcountry junk, snowshoes, traps, hides, the mangy stuffed head of a caribou Bud must have picked up at a fire sale someplace. But I didn't see Bud or Geordie. And then I realized they must be in the back room, the bedroom. And that made me feel strange, choked up in the pit of my throat as if somebody was trying to strangle me. It was snowing pretty steadily, 6 inches on the ground at least, and it muffled my footsteps as I worked my way around the cabin to the back window. The night was absolute, the sky so close it was breathing for me, in and out, and the snow held everything in the grip of silence. A candle was burning in the back window. I could tell it was a candle from the way the light wavered even before I got there. And I heard the music then. Violins all playing in unison, the sort of thing I wouldn't have expected from a lowlife like Bud. And voices, a low, intimate murmur of voices. That almost stopped me right there, that whispery blur of Geordie's voice and the deeper resonance of Bud's. And for a moment, everything hung in the balance. A part of me wanted to back away from that window, creep back to the canoe and forget all about it. But I didn't. I couldn't. I'd seen her first. I'd squeezed her hand and given her the corsage and admired the hand-lettered name tag, and it wasn't right. The murmur of those voices rose up in my head like a scream, and there was nothing more to do. My shoulder hit the back door just above the latch and blew the thing off the hinges like a toy, and there I was, breathing hard and white to the eyebrows. I saw them in the bed together, and heard this little bird-like cry from Geordie and a curse from Bud, and then the dog came hurtling in from the front room as if he'd been launched from a cannon. And I should say here that I like dogs, and that I've never lifted a finger to hurt any dog I've ever owned. But I had to put this one down. I didn't have any choice. I caught him as he left the floor and slammed him into the wall behind me till he collapsed in a heap. Geordie was screaming now, actually screaming, and you would have thought that I was the bad guy, but I tried to calm her, her arms bare and the comforter pulled up over her breasts and Bud's plastic feet set there like slippers on the floor, telling her a mile a minute that I'd protect her, it was all right, and that I'd see that Bud was prosecuted to the fullest extent. But then Bud was fumbling under the mattress for something like the snake he was, and I took hold of his puny slip of a wrist with the blue-black 38 special in it and just squeezed till his other hand came up and I caught that one and squeezed it too. Geordie made a bolt for the other room and I could see that she was naked, and I knew right then he must have raped her because there was no way she'd ever consent to anything with a slime like that. Not Geordie, not my Geordie. And the thought of what Bud had done to her made me angry. The gun was on the floor now, and I kicked it under the bed and let go of Bud's wrists and shut up his stream of curses and vile, foul language with a quick stab to the bridge of his nose, and it was almost like a reflex. He went limp under the force of that blow, and I was upset, I admit it. I was furious over what he'd done to that girl, and it just seemed like the most natural thing in the world to reach out and put a little pressure on his throat till the raw-looking stumps of his legs lay still on the blanket. That was when I became aware of the music again, the violins swelling up and out of a black plastic boombox on the shelf till they filled the room and the wind blew through the doorway and the splintered door groaned on its broken latch. Geordie, I was thinking. Geordie needs me to get her out of this. And I went into the front room to tell her about the snow and how it was coming down out of season and what that meant. She was crouched in the corner across from the stove and her face was wet and she was shivering. Her sweater was clutched up around her neck, and she'd got one leg of her jeans on, but the other leg was bare, sculpted bare and white all the way from her little painted toenails to the curve of her thigh and beyond. It was a hard moment, and I tried to explain it to her. I did. "Look outside," I said. "Look out there into the night. You see that?" She lifted her chin then and looked out beyond the doorway to the back room, beyond Bud on his bed and the dog on the floor, and into the gaping hole where the door had been. And there it was, coming down like the end of everything, snow, and there was only one name for it now. I tried to tell her that, because we weren't going anywhere. Thank you.
Ask your questions in English, please. If you're not comfortable with that language, you can put them in English, and I will, in Dutch, and I will try to translate. That was a very wonderful story. Plastic feet again.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, I knew you were going to ask about that, and I've decided for my new aesthetic to write only about people who have no feet. No, believe me, it's only the second time I've ever dealt with this.
That's not true, because I remember a very early story of yours that the title escapes me, that also features...
The Arctic Explorer.
That must have been the one, yeah. So it's actually the third time.
Perhaps I should take my shoes off.
No, but is there an explanation for this fascination with... well, no, it's not a fascination. That's 3 times is not a fascination, is it?
No, I think it's a sick compulsion and obsession. Actually, I have a dear friend who is a footless man, and he lost his feet in the manner of Walter Van Brunt in separate motorcycle accidents when he went down on his Harley. He was a kid who grew up in our neighborhood, and I knew him pretty well until we were about 13 or so, and then we were about 19. Somebody said, "Hey, did you hear about Jay? He went down on his Harley and ripped his right foot off." I said, "Jesus, that's terrible." So then about 10 years later, somebody said, "Hey, did you hear about Jay? He went down on his left foot and ripped his left foot off." And I said, "Boy, that's terrible." And then when I came to New York to live again, or returned to New York to work on World's End, I met him again. He came into a party, and I met him. And what's even more wonderful, those of you who know my story, Modern Love, about the very fastidious, obsessive girl who insists that her lover wear a full-body condom before she'll make love with him. Well, the most amazing thing is that that girl, through me, through my offices, and this guy with no feet are now happily married. So you see, it's no stretch for me to write fiction. Yeah. It's all true.
The story reminds me of a lot of your other stories in the sense that it starts extremely funny but turns very nasty somehow. Remains very funny though. But somebody compared your stories to those of Flannery O'Connor. Is that a comparison that you're happy with?
Yes, Flannery O'Connor is one of my literary heroes. She was able to write a story which takes you off guard. You think that this is going to be a comic universe, and in comedy, as we know, for instance, from Shakespeare's plays, in the comedies, no matter how entangled things get, we always know that everyone will be married happily at the end. And in the tragedies, we're all set for that. We know that, everyone will die at the end. Well, in Flannery O'Connor's stories, like A Good Man is Hard to Find, she catches you off guard because you think this is a comic universe. This guy with this horrible family going on their vacation, the kids are brats, and then the story suddenly turns on you and becomes very dramatic and grim. And I think, in a way, that can be more effective than just working in let's say a tragic mode where you're working on this level. You see, with a comic story, you can have everybody way up here and bring them way down here at the end.
Well, which brings us neatly into the Tortilla Curtain, I think, because that also, it's not it doesn't start out, well, it is a tragic story, but also has its comic scenes. I explained a bit for those of you who are not familiar with the novel, what it's about. You open that book with a motto from John Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, about a previous wave of immigrants to the great and wonderful state of California. A very different time and a very different book. Why did you choose that motto?
Well, the opening epigraph is from John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and it is, they are animals. Nobody could live like that and not be an animal, more or less. That paraphrases the quote. And, as Jan points out, I'm dealing with, I'm trying to see how John Steinbeck's ethos would play. Can you write a muckraking novel in 1995? Are the issues as black and white as they might have been in 1939? I think not. I think things are much more complex. For instance, we now have to deal with the fact that there are 5.5 billion people on the planet, projected to double in another 40 years. And what does that do to the mix? Do you always then invite the downtrodden and into your home and try to elevate them and help them? Is it as simple as that? I just wondered how that would play, and how maybe this struggle for resources among all of our species, Homo sapiens, if this doesn't really exacerbate racial tensions and tribal tensions. It's a thing that's going on throughout the industrialized world today, in Holland, in France, in Germany, in Great Britain, and particularly in America. The Latinos coming across the border are often dehumanized in the press and by the Americans, the Native Americans who already live there, because I think that's a way of not having to deal with the problem of the guy with the bag of oranges on the street. If he's not human, you don't have to deal with it. You can just drive by in your car. So in this book, I tried to give you 4 points of view. The white couple, Delaney and Kyra Mosbacher, the Latino couple from Mexico, illegals from Mexico, Candido America Rincon. You get all 4 points of view, and I think you get a pretty good idea of what the problems are, and you can resolve them for yourself.
It's you also go to the extent of trying to make Candido. Candido is Candido.
If it didn't have an accent, it would be Candido, but it needs an accent on the A, so it's Candido.
Candido.
But he is named after his namesake in Voltaire.
Candide, who looks at the world as one bright and happy place and keeps on viewing it as such.
Despite the fact that every possible tragedy befalls him.
Exactly, as does Candido.
Right.
Yes. I like that touch in where he butchers Dame Edith, I think it is. Isn't that the cat that he? Yes.
Yes.
It's one of the moments where you almost are trying to get the audience to dislike him, because he he slaughters a cat with the obvious purpose of eating it, because they have no food. They live in the canyon, and they make they cook for themselves on a makeshift little firewood, and so they eat it. And he makes he makes his wife believe that it's a rabbit, isn't it?
Yes, and it's really no big deal. I mean, we should invite the entire audience out afterward for a nice cat sandwich. Why not?
What you just said is the problem is not as black and white as it was in the days of John Steinbeck. That wave of immigrants was viewed with hostility also by the Californians, who preferred to kick back the ladder. But that was a wave of people who looked the same and prayed to the same gods.
Exactly. They were American citizens of the same race. And, during the Dust Bowl, California Highway Patrol blocked all the roads into California to keep the Okies, as they called them, out. We have the same situation obtaining now, only these are people of another race and of another nationality. And that makes it all the more difficult a situation, and I think all the easier for the natives to ignore them and to dehumanize them.
How much are the Californians aware that their economy is in large part dependent on that wave of immigrants?
Obviously, a great deal. You see, part of the problem has been the desire, particularly in Southern California, which has always been a very conservative place, despite what you may see on the TV and in the movies, to have a cheap pool of labor. The LA Times building was bombed in 1911 by an anarchist protesting their anti-labor stance. So this has been going on for a long time. Well, of course, now there are no more unions, and there is just a huge pool of basically slave labor. If you don't want to work for $3 an hour, well, I go back to Mexico. We've got 60 other guys here waiting for the job. So yeah, certainly the problem in agribusiness and textiles has been compounded by the business interests.
Many of your books and stories have their origin in a news story or an anecdote. Is there any such thing that preceded the Tortilla Curtain, or did you just decide to juxtapose these two stories?
Choice B.
Choice B?
Yes. The second part. Yes.
I
wanted to juxtapose the
choice
story.
B. Choice.
It's like in the Chinese restaurant. Did you want A or B? I didn't have an anecdote to start the story. I didn't have a story. I let the story evolve as I went along. I was very concerned, still am very concerned about the situation, and I wondered how I would feel about it ultimately, and how it would work out as a sort of a fable or a morality play. So it was the issue that it took off from. But of course, it is my most overtly political book, and my least funny. I have to admit that. But for those of you who want funny, funny is coming next. You write things like this in order to work out how you feel. I don't have an agenda. I don't write essays. I'm not a polemicist. I write in order to work out my own feelings on issues like this.
Many of your books are about the as it's called in the papers, the immigrant experience. You, in a way, are an immigrant yourself now in the state of California. How does it feel to be a boy from the East living in the West?
Well, first of all, I should say that Jim Morrison was right. The West is the best, and I'm never coming back again. Secondly, yes, it's true. When I moved to California in 1978, there was a huge internal migration of people to California. I think that's changed, and people are migrating out now. When I first arrived, there were so few native Californians compared to the huge volume of non-native Californians from all over the world. There are 30 million people living in California, by the way. And California itself is the 7th largest economy in the world. There were license plates that said Native Californian on them. But I now point out to those people that pretty soon most of the people in the world will be Native Californians.
I would like to talk about World's End for just a little while, because I was intrigued by your motives to write it. Is it true that you wrote it as a fictional autobiography, and if so, is there a trace of Dutch in your past?
Well, as you know, my mother's father was reputedly Dutch. His name was Post. And I think it must be true, because now that I've arrived at this advanced age, I realize that I have an obsessive compulsion with cleanliness, of all things.
Cleanliness?
So, yeah, I don't really know much about my family history. My mother's father, again, he was not present, and he was reputed. Her maiden name is Post. And my grandfather on the other side was Irish, and my mother's mother was Irish. So that's all I know. And rather than, go and look up genealogical charts, I thought I would invent a past and dream about it. And in turn, take in the whole history of the Hudson Valley. Probably a couple people in this room know this, but most people in America have no idea that New York used to be New Amsterdam, and it was a Dutch colony. People tend to forget these things as the years go by. So I wanted to explore that, explore the history of it. And at the same time, I was very interested in a kind of determinism. If you inherit from your parents some sort of gift or intelligence or beauty or whatever you have, what are the negative things that you inherit? Greed, psychological things or things that are, for instance, a propensity to be addicted to alcohol or drugs or whatever. And I wondered if this could extend even to behavior beyond what you learn and what you're acculturated to. And in Walter Van Brunt, I created a character who is sort of not only locked in genetically to his parents in a kind of deterministic way, but also psychologically.
So the answer to the question that you were exploring is yes.
Well, yes, in this case, and maybe, and it could be.
But in his case, yes, because when he finally, at the end of the book, or almost at the end of the book, he encounters his father, also in Alaska, by the way. He shouts out at him, fate, history, you cannot escape it. And that sets Walter that makes Walter think that, well, he cannot escape it, and he goes on doing the same type of deeds that made his father so very, very unpopular in the family.
His friends in the same way that his father had betrayed his. Yeah.
Yes. Are there these deterministic traits in your genealogy as well?
Well, I wonder, and of course we'll have to let the biographer answer that question. It's certainly nothing I'd want to discuss in public.
I read in an interview that you fulminated against Hollywood and how it has corrupted writers, and you've told about your objections to to the way the screen adopts novels. And you said, now that I have enough money, they will certainly not succeed in persuading me to have one of my novels be adapted.
No, that's not true.
But that I quote from an interview. So.
Well, sometimes the press gets these things wrong. No.
Well, but so were these opinions never yours, or
No,
were
I
they
have-
changed after The Road to Wellville was
No, I am
made into
absolutely
a movie?
unshakable and rigid in my determination to write novels and stories only, and not to work for anyone or to work in Hollywood. The quote may be a little backwards. I've always said, and I still say, that I just don't want to work for anybody else. I don't want to work in Hollywood. However, I have sold the rights in many books, many of my books and stories to Hollywood, because I see it as a way of getting the word out on the books. I see it as a sort of marketing tool for the books, and I have no objection to it. I've been lucky so far in that, the first major film was made by Alan Parker, who's a very brilliant director. Now, maybe if someone had made a real stinker of a movie, I would object. You don't have to sell the screen rights. There's nothing in your contract that says you have to sell screen rights. You have the choice of doing that and cashing a big fat check, or having your wife toss the manuscript on the casket as it's lowered into the grave. And I choose the former. And I do truly see it as a way of getting the word out in the books. As a result of Alan Parker's movie, which wasn't very well received in America, by the way, nonetheless, all the reviewers said, well, it's not as good as the book. And then, people went out and bought it anyway. So, so it did fine for me.
The same was said about the Bible. I mean, the movie was not as good as the book. So.
And that was true.
It was true, yeah. But The Road to Wellville was the only one that was in fact made into a movie, wasn't it?
Of a major Hollywood movie. There were two others. Greasy Lake was made into a short film for the AFI Festival, American Film Institute Festival in LA a few years back, by Damian Harris, and it starred Eric Stoltz and James Spader. It was a half-hour movie, which I thought was brilliantly done. And prior to that, one of my students, Greg Beeman, had made a beautiful little movie, half-hour movie, of The Big Garage. And he went straight from that to directing a feature in Hollywood, which is pretty rare. And he wound up making the immortal film License to Drive.
License to Drive?
Yes.
One of the reviewers, I now remember, of the Tortilla Curtain mentions the screenplay potential of that book. What is your opinion?
Well, I'd be happy if someone would make a movie, but I think it would be difficult because it could very easily be a sappy kind of production with a kind of Walt Disney ending to it, and I wouldn't like that at all. So I don't know. There is an offer for it at this juncture, but I don't know what will come of it. Again, you can't really invest your time in Hollywood or worry about it because they'll keep you on the line forever. For instance, as some of you may know, Budding Prospects, which would make a fine film. It's got plenty of dialogue. It's got a great story, and it's very cheap to make. All you need is a shack and a field full of marijuana, and you can make the movie. So that one has gone through 5 separate deals and 5 separate scripts having been written. And what if I had invested my time and energy in any one of those scripts? What a waste. My life's job is to write fiction. Only I can write the next book. Anybody can write a script. In fact, I'm sure everybody in the audience right now is writing a film script.
Probably everybody is, yeah. I would like to give the opportunity for the first round of questions from the audience, and maybe we could start if you don't object. Maybe we could start with questions about the Tortilla Curtain.
Of course, whatever.
Who would like to pose a question about the latest novel that presumably some of you have read?
Again, I'm very pleased to take questions on any subject except specific mathematical questions.
Wie mag ik het woord geven?
Yes, we're here.
I was interested to hear you mention Flannery O'Connor because she's my favorite. And in fact, I spent about 3 days last summer in Milledgeville looking at the rewrites for a story that she wrote called Parker's Back, which was really interesting because it's not a very long story, but the material she wrote on it is about 2 inches thick. Could you say something about your own rewrite procedure or your process?
Sure. Could you tell me a little bit more about Flannery O'Connor's process? What she wrote a much longer story and drew it down, do you mean?
Well, she wrote a variety of sort of short pieces that dead-ended, that pertained to the general subject in the process of writing, many of which she later put aside and didn't use. So there are multiple pages that have to do with the story Parker's Back, but really aren't in the story anymore. And then she also just rewrote extensively, 2, 3, 4 drafts. They're all very
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah.
Paragraphs and sentences and descriptions and so forth multiple times.
Well, I'm glad you told me that, because if there is a hell, I will certainly go there, and they will make me write stories in that way. But in this life, I could never conceive of writing a story like that. It would make me, within a week, I'd be wrapped in chains in the sub-basement of the madhouse. It would be impossible. Everything I've written, including something like the Tortilla Curtain, evolves from an opening line, whether it's a 2-page story or the story I read you tonight or a 500-page novel. It all evolves from the opening line, and I have no idea what will happen, where it will go, or what I will say. In fact, that's why I write fiction, because it's a puzzle. It's a process of tapping the unconscious mind and allowing it to resolve the problems. Particularly in a novel, I've discovered that whatever you lay down in the first chapter or two, the tone you've chosen, the characters you introduce, the metaphoric structure that comes to being, is coming from some part of you that goes beyond the conscious process. And your job is to try to resolve that structurally. That is an incredible puzzle that might take years to figure out. In the case of something like World's End, 3 years. In the case of the Tortilla Curtain, a year or so. And all that time, I'm working over and over on the lines I've already written. Each day, typically, let's say I'm on page 150 of a novel. Well, the next day, I will take the pages I wrote the previous day and write them over and over, trying to get into that sort of state of mind where I'm not aware that I'm working and I'm not aware what I'm doing, and I'm allowing the unconscious mind to resolve some of the problems. And then maybe that day I'll leap ahead and write some new pages. And the following day come back and clean them up and move them forward. But I could never write bits here and there and then try to paste them together. As many writers will also write straight through in a frenzy and then go back and spend a long time shuffling and so on. No, I could never do that.
So, any more questions not about the Tortilla Curtain? Over there.
Along the same line, do you want to do a lot of research in order to come up with the ideas? Or maybe work out details?
Do I do a lot of research for all the work or a specific one? Yes, I do. Again, we're just talking about the process of how you can stimulate your creative juices to get flowing, and your imagination. And one way is to be reading material pertaining to what you're going to do. This is why I love historical novels so much. As I said, I did go back to where I grew up and was a young sneering punk who ignored his school teachers and the history that took place in around his own place where I grew up. And then came back as a mature adult and visited all the historical sites and really thought about it. In relation to the book that I am now going to start writing as soon as my publishers let me go home, I did research on a new historical novel this summer, and I would like to tell you the story of what I'm going to write next. I found a real story. Since Water Music, which told of Mungo Park, and Budding Prospects, which is also a true story, all my other stories have been invented purely. This time, I'm going back to an historical setting where I have a story, and here it is. In my new town of Santa Barbara, which is 100 miles north of Los Angeles. It was, in the turn of the century, a very wealthy area where many big industrialists went and built these big estates. On one of them lived a man who was heir to one of the great industrial fortunes of America. He was an extremely cultured man. He was very bright. He graduated in 1896 cum laude from Princeton. He was very tall, 6'4", very handsome. When he was 30 and she was 29, he married a young woman every bit his equal. She was the second female graduate of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the first in the sciences. She's very beautiful, very, very wealthy, and very continental. Her parents owned a chateau in Lake Geneva. She spent all her summers in Switzerland. She knew French and German. But, you see, who would want to write that story? But, shortly after their marriage in 1904, he had a severe schizophrenic breakdown, brought on both by genetic factors and by psychological factors, particularly psychosexual factors. So severe that for the next 20 years, he never laid eyes on any woman, not his wife, his mother, his sisters, because if he saw a woman, he would violently assault her. So, his wife, mother, and sisters had to view him on his estate through binoculars. 20 years later, the wife, who kept pressing for some kind of cure to this, even though she couldn't see him, she spoke with him on the phone and sent him letters. His bed is wonderful, by the way. It's a brass bed bolted to the floor and a window with bars on it in this magnificent estate. In the 20s, she brought in a Freudian psychologist, and with the help of analysis, this gentleman improved enough so that he could then, for the first time in 20 years, see his wife again. And what a touching reunion that will be in my version. Plus, this book has monkeys in it. Those of you who know my work know how much I love monkeys. The first primate lab in the world was on this gentleman's estate, 1914 to 1918. The shrink of that day had convinced the wife that if she were to fund this monkey project, he could study the sexual habits of monkeys, apply them to her husband, and cure him. But of course, it didn't work. So that's next. And I've spent most of the summer reading the material. It's very well documented because this man was declared in the courts an incompetent person. He had 3 conservators, his brother, his sister, and his wife. So they had to report each year to the court to make sure that he was still an incompetent person, because we're talking millions of dollars at stake here. So everything he did was very, very well documented. You'll probably be interested and enlightened to know that this gentleman masturbated 5.8 times per week in 1932. That's what they could observe through the keyhole of the bathroom, by the way.
Any more questions? Yes, over there.
You're one of the few contemporary writers that seem so successful with writing both short stories and full-length novels. Do you have a preference for one or the other? Do you find one to be more difficult than the other to write? Do you approach writing short stories differently than you do your full-length novels?
No, I don't find one more difficult than the other. And I feel very lucky in 2 ways. One, that I began as a story writer, and 2, that I don't limit myself to things that I know, or autobiographical things. You know, I find so many of my contemporaries get bogged down writing about writers, for instance. I mean, how interesting is a writer's life? You know, what do? They cheat on their wives and they type manuscripts. You know, it's not that interesting.
And or they write about 5.8 times a week.
And they masturbate 5.8 times a week. Thank you, Jan. You know, so I felt that I could deal with any subject anywhere, and the stories particularly are good for this. Anything that occurs to me, anything you may tell me tonight, anything I may read in the paper or see, could be a story, anything. That's very liberating in a way. The problem with stories, though, is that a story like the one you heard tonight might take me a month to write. And the first week of that month is agony, because the gift is gone, you're worthless, you'll never write again, you're a failure, you're miserable. And then finally you get an idea and it starts to come, and maybe the middle 2 weeks of the month you're actually writing the story. The final week, you're polishing it, you send it off. Then the whole process starts again. You're worthless, you'll never write again. You get this going. So that's tough. On the other hand, with a novel, the hard part is you can't, you're locked into a project for a given period of time, and you can't really work into it what you learn each day and what interests you each day. On the other hand, what's good about it is you know what you're going to do tomorrow morning. So they both have their joys and their drawbacks, but I feel very lucky in that I can go from one to the other. Many novelists have a long down period in between, and I think it's got to be psychologically difficult not to be working, because, as I've said, I believe writing is an obsessive-compulsive disorder, and if you're not doing it, you're in big trouble. An example is when I finished East is East. I happened to be up in a cabin in the Sierra Nevada where I often go, and it was the first time I'd been up there without any companionship, without my family, without any friends. I finished the novel. I felt a tremendous rush of satisfaction and joy. I mailed it off, and I had a day up there, the day after I finished, the kind of day you have in childhood where, the day is infinitely long, you have nothing to do. I walked out in the woods, I read a book, I put off going to the bar until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and, the whole works. The next day I was so bored I wrote a new story. So it is good to keep working, and I'm glad that I can write both stories and novels for that reason.
Have you ever ditched a project, either short or long, because there was not enough to sustain it?
Yes, but that particularly happens, I think, with young writers. In the beginning, you may, half the things you write, you may get halfway through and throw it away. But I think as you get on, you may self-edit. And you get to a certain point where you know what you want to pursue to the end and what you don't. So you would never go more than a page or a paragraph or two before you discard that idea. Mm-hmm. And maybe not even that far. You may discard it just in thinking about it for a minute.
And that's it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would like to go back to the genesis of World's End. On the one hand, you credit a lot of people with gathering material for you, mm-hmm. But you also said to one interviewer that by the time the book was finished, your thumb was sore of sucking on it. Pardon?
How do you mean?
Letting your fantasy work, of course.
Oh,
I mean, it's fantasizing the book is.
Yes.
What part was what part did research mean in the creation of the?
When I put acknowledgments in the book that I thank so and so and so and so helping me with material. This is anyone who has been generous enough to give me some time. I don't have research assistants per se who go out and and get me volumes of work. With one exception, I did have a student assistant who was great. I could say, please go get me 6 books on Freud, and he would give me 6 books on Freud. But basically, I do everything myself. When I thank people, it's because they are my advisors. I have my special advisors on many different subjects. I have a doctor who will tell me medical things. I have my gun and motorcycle expert whom I can call up and say, as in the case of World's End, what kind of motorbike might a kid have in 1958? Mm-hmm. And, he sits right there in his living room and reaches casually over to his huge mound of old motorcycle magazines and gives me a choice of 3. So those are the people I thank for taking time to help me mm-hmm. in that way mm-hmm. and to check to make sure I've been accurate on certain areas that I don't know much about.
Mm-hmm. And who helped you with the Dutch expressions, with the one that I referred to in my introduction?
Much of it, you did a wonderful job of putting them all together. Much of it I got from Washington Irving, because this is my take on the Dutch history of New York, and Washington Irving's very comic and distorted and bastardized take on it is Knickerbocker's History of New York. So I was consciously reflecting that and borrowed many of these terms, kind of antiquated or bastardized terms from him.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about World's End or any other subject, except mathematical?
Yeah, how do you form your visions before you sit down writing? You say you sit down and you write your first sentence and it goes from there, but I mean, I know that writers have visions on so many different matters, and like the story you just mentioned, 107 women in Alaska.
It's just, that's a great example. Just something like that can stimulate it. I pictured 107 women in their underwear. Okay. I mean, that's a picture, and you can see it. I don't know exactly how that process works. How come John Coltrane could compose as well as Bach, and he did it with his eyes closed, and he did it at that very moment, I don't know. It's just some kind of gift that writers have to be able to visualize things and then give it back to the reader, who then revisualizes it in his own way. It's just part of the magic of literature, I guess. I really can't say how that happens. You try, though. As I said in answer to this gentleman, you try to work up a state in which you're not really consciously aware of where you are. Just as you do when you're really absorbed in a good book. It's the same process, taking it out, as putting it in. If you're really absorbed in a good book, sometimes, you don't hear what's around you, and you're not aware of who you are. You're just absorbed in this text. And I think when you write it, it's the same kind of state.
Are you the kind of writer who sits down at his desk every morning at 9 o'clock and starts writing?
Yes, I am. I think, it would be nice, a lot of the audience likes to romanticize the writer who is out, at the clubs all night long, and then still produces great work. But I think, in fact, you have to stay with a project daily, and you can't really take weeks off or go to the Bahamas. Once you start a book, I think you have to pursue it constantly and think about it constantly until it's done.
Any other questions, please?
Yes?
Over there.
A question about Road to Wellville. Where did the idea come from to write about health craze in the 19th century?
Well,
History and ethnic history which you informed in the story. Where did it come from?
Well, as many of you know, I always have written about food because my mother never fed me enough when I was a child. And so food is a big natural thing for me to write about. I often use it as a metaphor for conspicuous consumption. How some of us have so much and others so little, and gluttony is a way of expressing that. So I've often written about food. It's a sort of natural subject for me. While I was writing World's End, a friend came to me, and his name is Kevin. Kevin came to me and he said, I have a great book for you to read, and I'll bet there's something in here that would stimulate you to write a story. And the book was The Nuts Among the Berries by R.M. Deutsch, which is now out of print, but it's a hilarious history of the health food movement from its origins in Europe throughout America up to the present time. But Kevin said to me, my friend Kevin is a filmmaker in Los Angeles, he said, but I myself was thinking someday of maybe making a film having something to do with Dr. Kellogg, so, choose some other character. And, I said, of course, because there are thousands of nuts connected with the health food movement. Post himself, C.W. Post, was an amazing crackpot and nutcase. Many were. And I said, sure, Kevin, I won't choose Kellogg. But, Kellogg began to take over the book because for my purposes, he did some great things. He was the first to become a vegetarian, or one of the first, and to emphasize exercise and fresh air and so on. He lived to be 93. So, who's keeping score here? If I make it even close to that, that would be a miracle. So, Kellogg began to take over the book pretty much because on the other hand, he was very much of a martinet and a charlatan and cocksure of himself, and he was willing to tell anybody exactly what to do. And as he took over, I began to advise my friend Kevin that, I always had to go back on my word a little bit, and Kellogg was beginning to take over. And Kevin would always say to me at this juncture, I would always say to Kevin at this juncture, well, but don't worry, when the book comes out, you will get a fat, and he would say, check? I'd say, no, not a check, a credit. You get a credit, and so he does. He gets a credit in the acknowledgments.
But why did he say that? Why did he not allow you to do that? Because he didn't agree with historical persons being used in fiction?
No. He just had some idea that maybe someday he would want to do something about Kellogg, but I got there first.
It's a tough act to follow, I should add. Any more questions? Yeah.
You once rewrote a story by Gogol, The Overcoat. I'm wondering if you're still influenced by Russian humor.
I am. But that story I wrote when I thought that the Iron Curtain would last for another 1,000 years. And in fact, I take full responsibility for bringing it down. You notice, after that story was published, the Iron Empire disappeared about 2 years later. And this was a critique of Soviet Russia. I just updated The Overcoat and used the same humor and the same storyline and updated it to the present, which was then early 80s, mid 80s, to criticize the workers' paradise. They didn't put the wall up to keep people from coming in to enjoy it. It was a political story in that sense. It was also an homage to Gogol. I've written a couple of other stories that update classic stories, like The Devil and Irv Chernisky, which updates The Devil and Tom Walker. Or I don't know if you're aware of it, but I am the one who wrote the sequel to Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. I wrote it in 11 pages, and it's called Me cago en la leche, which is the curse that is used in that book, meaning I shit in the milk of your mother. And it's subtitled Robert Jordan in Nicaragua, and I see that Robert Jordan, when he and the little rabbit had their 3 days of rapture, she got pregnant, she went back to his parents in Idaho, and they had a kid. And the kid now is a punk, with a punk haircut, and he goes down to Nicaragua to help the rebels because his old man did that. So I wrote the sequel to For Whom the Bell Tolls, just for fun.
There should be a lot more fun in literature. That's one of your credos, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes.
The stories you wrote about Jack Kerouac, like these, you're not seriously mean to say that they are homage to Jack Kerouac.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. I can't hear you.
I thought you were ridiculizing Jack Kerouac in stories like these.
I was ridiculing whom?
Jack Kerouac.
Oh, Jack Kerouac. Well, yes, I was ridiculing Jack Kerouac in Beat, and I admit it. But it was also kind of an homage, too, because I was having fun with his style. In fact, that's always a story I've wanted to read in public. I thought it would be fun. This is a story which makes fun of, but adopts the style of Kerouac's language to tell the story of a 17-year-old who went to visit Kerouac at his home in New York, in Long Island, in 1958. And what happened that day. And it's a fantastic story where, Ginsberg is there and Burroughs is there and the whole thing, but it's told in this breathless Kerouac kind of language. Yes? Yeah, I am ridiculing him, I admit it, but that's part of my job, is to make fun of everybody, including myself. You may know, some of you may know one of the news stories that I wrote after this one called Acades McNeil that was in the New Yorker this summer. Has a character in it who is, it's told from the point of view of a guy in college, and his father is a very famous writer. His father comes to the campus to give a reading, and he's a really skinny guy with a goatee and a black leather jacket, and need I say more?
Well, I think there's time for just a few more. Over there, yes.
At what point in your life did you decide to become a writer? Why was that?
Again, this will speak for the joys of an undergraduate education. I've often said if it weren't for undergraduate school and Psychology 101, there would be no psychologists in the world. No one would know it existed. And I was the same way. I went to undergraduate school to be a musician. I couldn't hack that, as we say, and I switched to a history major. and finally to literature. And in my junior year, my third year, I walked into a creative writing class and found that that was something I could do. The professor was an Indian writer from India by the name of Krishna Vad. He was a Harvard PhD and a very brilliant man. The other students, there were about 12 of them, like me, were the lame, halt, and crazy outcasts of the campus. And they, however, were all lame, crazy, outcast poets, and I was a lame, crazy, outcast nothing. And so for the first couple of weeks, they read this obtuse, impossible poetry aloud in class. I didn't know what to say about it or what it was. One of the girls, by the way, who was my fellow classmate, was a reincarnated Egyptian princess, and she had a tattoo on her ankle to prove it. So, during this reading of this impossible poetry, the professor, Krishna Vad, really was very non-committal. He certainly never praised anything, and he didn't have much to say. So finally, a few weeks went by, and he said, all right, it's your turn to write something. At the time, I had been reading the absurdist playwrights of the 50s, like Genet, Ionesco, and Beckett. And so I wrote a little one-act play, which, by the way, which also had to do with a severed foot. Oh, no. My God. And it was 10 or 12 pages, but it was very funny and it had a lot of black humor. And you know, creative writing is very competitive. None of your colleagues want to admit that you're any good, because then they have to reevaluate themselves. So as they began to read it, this professor, totally non-committal, began to laugh. And he laughed louder and louder, and pretty soon, grudgingly, the other poets had to laugh too. And finally, when I was done, he got up and applauded. And I thought, this is a pretty good gig.
And you put the guitar in the cupboard and never touched it again?
Well, I never played guitar, but no.
I thought you played in a rock and roll band.
I played saxophone, drums, and lead vocals. Yes.
Never played guitar. Oh.
One final question back here. Yes.
And who do you read if you have time to read other writers?
I read only literature. I don't mean to sound snobbish about it. It's just that I never read any genre writing. Far be it for me in public to make fun of vampire writers, but I don't read about vampires. I don't read about science fiction. I don't read detective novels, thrillers. They don't interest me in any way because they're formulaic. There is no surprise for me in repeating a formula, and I also don't like them because generally they don't have a lot of attention to language. They give us one thing only, and that is a story. But I think literature, like the stories that I try to give you, also give you a good story, but much more too. So I read what you would consider literary writers. And ironically, I mean, literature is almost like a genre too. People say, so you're a writer. Hey man, what do you write? Do you vampires? No, I don't write vampires. I write literature. So I read people like my contemporaries whom I like a lot in America are people like Dennis Johnson, who is absolutely brilliant, Louise Erdrich, the late Raymond Carver, Richard Ford, Ellen Gilchrist. There are just many, many very fine writers working in America today. Toby Wolfe. There's just a list. I always leave people out, but it's a long list of great writers out there today.
One really final, or the lady standing up there, or no? Yes, one, the real, yeah.
Which was the incentive for writing the Tortilla Curtain.
Was there a particular incident? No. No, there wasn't a particular incident. But again, I lived in LA for 16 years. I heard what people said behind closed doors about Latinos and about Mexicans in particular. I saw this sort of displacement of peoples. I saw this enormous growing population of peasants. We did, in America, we don't feel that we have peasants. We're all immigrants. We work hard. Everybody can be part of a democratic society. In many Latin American countries, this is not the case. There's an oligarchy at the top with gates and walls around their houses and with private armies, and then there are peasants, people who have never been educated and have never had any chance to. They only have labor to offer. And now in America, in LA, we have peasants. What about this? What do we do about this? This is what motivated me to begin writing it. But no particular incident, no.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
for your patience. Thank you very much, Tom.